Robert E. Lee had beaten every single Union general who came before Grant. Every single one. McDowell, McClellan, Pope, Burnside, Hooker, Meade. One by one, Lee had outmaneuvered them, outthought them, outfought them. And every single time the same thing happened. The Union Army took its losses, pulled back, regrouped, and waited. Lee knew this pattern better than anyone. He had built his entire strategy around it. Hit the Union Army hard enough, and they go back. They always go back. It was not just a military observation. It was a psychological fact that Lee had proven over and over again for 3 years of war. Until Grant. In the spring of 1864, Ulysses Grant was given command of all Union armies. Not just one army, all of them. Lincoln had finally found his general, and Grant immediately did something that none of his predecessors had ever done. He came south. He crossed the Rapidan River with 118,000 men, and he moved directly toward Lee. No cautious maneuvering, no waiting for the perfect moment. Straight at Lee through a dense tangle of Virginia forest called the Wilderness. Lee looked at this and smiled. The Wilderness was perfect defensive terrain. Grant's massive numerical advantage would be neutralized by the thick trees and undergrowth. Artillery would be useless. Coordinated attacks would be impossible. In the Wilderness, numbers did not matter. Tactical brilliance mattered. And tactical brilliance was Lee's greatest weapon. The Battle of the Wilderness lasted 2 days. May 5th and 6th, 1864. It was one of the most savage and chaotic battles of the entire war. Men fought at close range through dense forest, where visibility was sometimes no more than 10 feet. Units lost contact with each other. Commanders had no idea where their own men were. The forest itself caught fire, and wounded soldiers burned alive on the ground, unable to move. When it was over, Grant had lost 17,000 men in 2 days. 17,000. More casualties than any previous Union commander had taken in a single engagement against Lee. By every measure of the previous 3 years of war, this meant one thing. The Union Army would now turn around and go back north. Lee's veterans knew it. Lee's generals knew it. Lee himself knew it. The pattern was so established that Confederate soldiers almost took it for granted. Hit them hard enough, and they go back. They always go back. On the night of May 7th, 1864, the Army of the Potomac began to move. Lee's scouts reported the movement to Confederate headquarters. Union troops moving. The assumption in the Confederate camp was immediate and automatic. They are retreating. Grant is going back north, just like all the others. Just like McClellan after Antietam. Just like Hooker after Chancellorsville. Just like every other Union general who had felt the full force of Robert E. Lee's army and decided that discretion was the better part of valor. The war would continue its familiar rhythm. Lee would win a battle, the Union would retreat, regroup, and eventually send another general south to try again. It was the pattern that had kept the Confederacy alive for 3 years. But then something happened that nobody in the Confederate Army expected. The Union troops were not moving north. They were moving south. Grant was not retreating. Grant was advancing. He was moving around Lee's right flank toward Spotsylvania Courthouse, pushing deeper into Virginia, getting between Lee and Richmond. When this information reached Lee, the implications were immediate and staggering. This general was different. This general was not going back. The moment Grant's men realized they were moving south and not north became one of the most celebrated moments in the entire war. Soldiers who had fought under McClellan and Hooker and Burnside and had experienced the soul-crushing pattern of advance, brutal battle, retreat, understood immediately what this meant. As the columns moved south past the crossroads at Chancellorsville, the very place where Hooker had been humiliated by Lee the previous year, the men began to cheer, then to shout, then to sing. They threw their hats in the air. Veterans who had seen years of war and disappointment were openly emotional because they understood. This general was not like the others. This general was going forward. Grant rode past his cheering troops that night with a cigar clamped in his teeth and his hat pulled low. He did not acknowledge the cheering. He did not make a speech. He simply kept riding south. That image, Grant on horseback in the dark, moving forward, silent, relentless, became the defining image of what Grant was. Not a general who sought glory or dramatic gestures. A general who simply would not stop. Now let us go back and understand who Grant actually was, because his background explains everything about why he fought the way he did. Ulysses Grant was not supposed to be a great general. His early life gave almost no indication of future greatness. He was born in 1822 in Ohio, the son of a tanner. He was quiet, unremarkable, more comfortable with horses than with people. He went to West Point not because he wanted to, but because his father arranged it. He graduated in the middle of his class, not at the top, not at the bottom, the middle. He served adequately in the Mexican-American War, showed some ability under fire, but nothing that made senior officers take special notice. After the war, he was posted to remote frontier garrisons, and he was miserable. Separated from his wife and children, bored, isolated, Grant began to drink. The drinking became a problem. In 1854, he resigned from the army under pressure, almost certainly to avoid being court-martialed for drinking on duty. The next 7 years of Grant's life were a systematic failure. He tried farming and failed. He tried selling real estate and failed. He tried various business ventures and failed at all of them. By 1860, Ulysses Grant was 38 years old, broke, and working as a clerk in his father's leather goods store in Galena, Illinois. His father had given him a job out of pity. The man who would eventually save the Union was, at the start of the Civil War, a failed farmer, working in his father's shop. If you had looked at Grant's life in 1860, there was absolutely nothing to suggest that he was capable of anything extraordinary. Then the war started and everything changed. Grant immediately offered his services to the Union Army. His West Point training and Mexican War experience made him more qualified than most available men, and he was given command of a regiment of Illinois volunteers. What happened next revealed something about Grant that his years of failure had completely hidden. He was extraordinarily good at war. Not the ceremonial, political, image-conscious version of war that many Civil War generals practiced. The real version. Grant understood instinctively that war was about destroying the enemy's ability and will to fight. Everything else was secondary. Personal glory was secondary. Public opinion was secondary. Political considerations were secondary. Find the enemy. Hit them. Hit them again. Do not stop. By early 1862, Grant had already demonstrated this philosophy dramatically. He captured Fort Donelson in Tennessee after demanding unconditional surrender from the Confederate commander, the moment that gave him his famous nickname, Unconditional Surrender Grant. He fought the savage Battle of Shiloh in April 1862, took terrible casualties on the first day, and launched a devastating counterattack on the second day that drove the Confederates from the field. After Shiloh, there were calls for Lincoln to remove Grant because of the casualties. Lincoln famously refused. He said, "I cannot spare this man. He fights." That word, fights. It was the word that separated Grant from almost every other Union general. The Army of the Potomac in the Eastern Theater had been commanded by a succession of men who were brilliant at organizing armies, drilling troops, building supply lines, and then finding reasons not to fight. McClellan was perhaps the worst. He spent months preparing his perfect army and then discovered endless reasons why the moment for battle had not quite arrived. He needed more troops. The roads were bad. The enemy was stronger than reported. The supply situation needed attention. Lincoln once said in frustration that if McClellan was not going to use the army, he would like to borrow it for a while. Hooker talked aggressively before Chancellorsville and then lost his nerve at the critical moment. Burnside fought at Fredericksburg with suicidal frontal attacks that accomplished nothing except killing thousands of his own men. Lee had studied all of these men. He understood them. He knew their patterns, their hesitations, their psychological breaking points, and he had built a strategy of aggressive defense designed to exploit those weaknesses. Lee could not match Grant's resources. The Confederacy was outnumbered and outproduced in almost every measurable category. Lee's only real advantages were the skill of his army, the quality of his generals, and his own tactical genius. But those advantages only worked if the Union Army cooperated by retreating after taking heavy losses. The entire Confederate strategic position depended on Union generals deciding that the cost of continuing to fight was too high. Lee needed Union generals who would go back. And for 3 years, that is exactly what he got. Grant changed the equation entirely. And the reason Grant could change it came down to one fundamental difference in how he understood the war. Every Union general before Grant in the Eastern Theater had thought about the war in terms of territory and position. Take Richmond. Hold this river line. Secure this railroad junction. Defend this position. Lee was a master of this kind of positional warfare, and he consistently outmaneuvered Union generals who thought this way. Grant did not think this way. Grant thought about the war in terms of destruction, not territory, not position. Destruction. Destroy Lee's army. That was the entire strategy. Everything else was a distraction. Grant explained his thinking with characteristic bluntness when he took command. He said, "Wherever Lee goes, I will follow him. Not wherever Richmond is, I will march toward it. Wherever Lee goes." The target was not the Confederate capital. The target was the Confederate Army. Specifically, Robert E. Lee. Grant understood that as long as Lee's army existed, the Confederacy existed. And as long as Grant's army was bigger and better supplied and willing to absorb casualties and keep fighting, Lee's army would eventually be ground down to nothing. It was brutal mathematics. And Grant was willing to do the brutal mathematics that nobody before him had been willing to do. This is the part that makes Grant a genuinely complicated figure to understand. Because the strategy that won the war was also a strategy that got an enormous number of men killed. The Overland Campaign of 1864, the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, the March to Petersburg, was one of the bloodiest stretches of fighting in the entire war. Grant lost 65,000 men in 6 weeks. 65,000. The newspapers in the North called him a butcher. They called him a drunk. They demanded Lincoln remove him. There were protests in northern cities. The political pressure on Lincoln to fire Grant and negotiate a peace with the Confederacy was enormous. Grant did not respond to the criticism. He did not give interviews defending himself. He did not write letters to newspapers explaining his strategy. He simply kept moving south. After the Wilderness, he moved to Spotsylvania. After Spotsylvania, he moved to the North Anna River. After the North Anna River, he moved to Cold Harbor. After the disaster at Cold Harbor, where he lost 7,000 men in 20 minutes in a frontal assault, he would later say he regretted. He did the most audacious thing of the entire campaign. He secretly moved his entire army across the James River and swung south toward Petersburg, threatening Richmond from a completely unexpected direction. Lee almost missed the move entirely. It was the most technically difficult military maneuver of the entire war, and Grant executed it in secret in less than a week. That is what Grant looked like when he was operating at his full capability. Not a butcher stumbling forward. A calculating strategist, willing to absorb punishment in order to deliver something worse. Robert E. Lee watched all of this and understood what it meant better than anyone. Lee was not a man given to panic or despair. He had fought through 3 years of war with limited resources against a larger enemy and had somehow kept the Confederacy alive through sheer force of will and tactical brilliance. But Grant worried him in a way that no previous Union commander had. After the Wilderness, after it became clear that Grant was not retreating, Lee said something to his staff that revealed his understanding of the new situation. He said that the Army of Northern Virginia could not stand a prolonged siege. He said that if Grant got them fixed in position around Richmond and Petersburg, it would only be a matter of time. Lee understood that his strategy of aggressive defense only worked against generals who would eventually go back. Against a general who would not go back, who would simply absorb losses and keep pushing, Lee's mathematical disadvantage in men and supplies would eventually become decisive. Lee was right. The siege of Petersburg lasted 9 months. From June 1864 to April 1865. 9 months of trench warfare, constant Union pressure, steady Confederate losses that could not be replaced. Lee's army shrank. Desertions increased. Supply lines were cut one by one. The Army of Northern Virginia that had terrified the Union for 3 years slowly starved and bled in the trenches outside Petersburg, while Grant methodically extended his lines further and further west, stretching the Confederate defenses thinner and thinner, until finally they broke. When the Petersburg lines collapsed in April 1865, Lee tried to run. He moved west with what remained of his army, trying to reach Confederate forces in North Carolina. Grant pursued him relentlessly, cutting off every possible escape route with a combination of cavalry raids and forced marches that pushed Union soldiers to their absolute physical limits. Within a week, Lee's army was surrounded at a small Virginia village called Appomattox Courthouse. Lee sent a message to Grant asking for terms. Grant's terms were generous. Confederate soldiers could go home, officers could keep their sidearms, men who owned horses could keep them for the spring planting. It was not the terms of a man interested in humiliation. It was the terms of a man who wanted the war to end, and wanted it to end in a way that made Reconstruction possible. On April 9, 1865, Robert E. Lee rode to a farmhouse at Appomattox and surrendered to Ulysses Grant. Lee was in his finest dress uniform with his ceremonial sword. Grant arrived in a mud-spattered private's uniform with only his lieutenant general's shoulder straps to indicate his rank. He had ridden hard to get there and had not had time to change. Lee looked at Grant's uniform and said nothing. They sat together in the front parlor of the McClellan house and talked for a while about the Mexican War, where both men had served. Then they worked out the surrender terms. Then it was over. 4 years of war. 600,000 dead. And it ended in a farmhouse parlor with 2 tired men sitting across a table from each other. Lee rode out of Appomattox on his gray horse traveler. His remaining soldiers crowded the road to watch him pass. Many of them were weeping. Lee was barely holding himself together. He had given everything he had for 4 years, and it had not been enough. As he rode away, he passed a group of his veterans who reached out to touch Traveler, to touch Lee's boots, just to make contact with the man they had followed through everything. Lee could not speak. He simply nodded and kept riding. Grant did not watch. When Lee left the farmhouse, Grant walked outside, saw his staff beginning to cheer and celebrate, and immediately stopped them. He said, "The war is over. The rebels are our countrymen again." He would not allow celebration. He ordered his artillery to stop firing victory salutes because he said the sound would only humiliate men who were now their fellow citizens. That restraint in victory, that understanding that winning the war was only the beginning of a much harder problem, was Grant at his most admirable. He will not go back. Those words, or words like them, were spoken in Confederate camps after the Wilderness, when it became clear that Grant was advancing south. They captured in 4 words everything that made Grant different from every General Lee had faced before. Not smarter necessarily, not more tactically brilliant. Lee was probably the better battlefield tactician. But Grant had something that tactical brilliance could not match. He had the will to continue regardless of cost, regardless of criticism, regardless of how bad the previous day had been. He woke up every morning and moved south. That was his entire genius. And it was enough. It was more than enough. Because in the end, Robert E. Lee, for all his brilliance and courage and the devotion of his men, could not beat an enemy who simply refused to stop.